The marble floor of Charleston's City Hall gleamed like water under glass, the scent of polished wood and old paper thick in the air. At the far end, cameras flashed as Gregory Hunt stood behind a row of microphones, his silver tie catching the light. Charts and renderings of the new harbor park glowed on giant screens, imported trees, manicured lawns, winding stone paths. Janet Miller moved along the back wall, her cart of cleaning supplies rattling softly, eyes scanning the plans more than the floor. Maria Lopez's voice cut through the applause. What's your flood resilience plan for these imports during hurricane season? Gregory smoothed his jacket. We've accounted for it, he said, without looking at her. Janet felt the words push at her chest before they slipped out. Half those trees will drown in the first storm surge. The room stilled for a beat, then rippled with laughter. Gregory turned, smile sharpened. And you know that from a mop bucket? Janet didn't blink. From 20 years watching what lives and what dies in this soil. A murmur rolled through the press. Gregory leaned forward, voice dropping into a challenge that carried to the rafters. If you're so smart, fix it now. The door closed behind them with a heavy click, shutting out the chatter and camera flashes. In the small conference room, the air felt cooler, tighter. Mayor Ross took the seat at the head of the table, his elbows resting on the wood. Eyes fixed on Janet. She stood beside her cleaning cart for a moment, unsure she should sit, but Maria had already spread out a large sheet of paper across the table, the official park layout. Her finger stopping at the low-lying section nearest the harbor. Storm water will sit here. Roots will rot. The ground will sour, she said, her voice steady but low. She pointed to the open lawns. Too much sun for these imports. They'll bake before they bloom. Maria leaned in, sketching quick adjustments in pencil. Tighter tree clusters for windbreak, shaded seating under native oaks. Rain gardens carved where the land dipped. Gregory sat slouched in the corner, tapping his pen, the faintest smirk on his face. You're talking about replanting half the plan, he said. Janet didn't look at him. I'm talking about planting something that will survive. Maria slid her notes toward the mayor, the page now a mix of precise lines and hurried scribbles. We can source all of this locally. Costs less, lasts longer, and the roots already know this soil. Ross studied the paper, then looked up at Janet. 48 hours. One quadrant. Make it breathe. Gregory straightened, the smirk gone. You're not serious. But Ross was already pushing his chair back, rising with a decision that seemed to fill the room. I am. Janet nodded once, gathering the paper to her chest as though it were something fragile. She didn't smile. Not yet. Night draped itself over the harbor, the kind of heavy, salt-sweet darkness that clings to your skin. Janet's apartment sat 4 floors above a fish market that never really slept. She could hear the faint clatter of crates and the low hum of boat engines through the open window. Inside, the light from a single lamp spilled across the small living room, where Lila sat cross-legged on the rug, a box of crayons scattered around her. The girl was bent over a sheet of paper, drawing a patchwork of trees and flowers, all guarded by a fence she'd colored a bright, defiant blue. She didn't look up when she asked, Mom, why do they laugh at you? Janet froze in the doorway, her hand still on the knob. She wanted to brush it off, but the question hung there, soft and heavy. She set down her bag, crossed the room, and knelt beside her daughter. Because some folks, she said quietly, think a quiet voice means you've got nothing worth hearing. Lila glanced up, eyes wide and serious. But you told the truth. Janet smoothed her daughter's hair, swallowing the tightness in her throat. Outside, a foghorn groaned in the distance, pulling her mind backward. Years ago, standing with her mother in waist-deep water, the river swollen after weeks of rain. She could still see the porch of their house slipping under the brown current, could still feel the way her mother's arm tightened around her shoulders. The levee had been stripped bare by developers chasing a quick dollar. The trees were gone, and with them, the safety they'd promised. She blinked, the memory dissolving into the warm lamplight. Lila was holding up her drawing now. This is the park you're going to make, right? Janet studied the jumble of bright colors and odd shapes. It wasn't perfect, but every tree in that picture was strong, wide-rooted, and standing together. She smiled. Not the tired smile she wore at City Hall, but the kind that reached her eyes. Yeah, baby, that's the one. In the harbor below, a boat horn cut through the night again. This time, it sounded like a starting gun. The hour hand had slid past midnight, the city outside breathing in a slower rhythm. From the open window of Janet's apartment, the smell of the harbor crept in, salt, diesel, and the faint sweetness of shrimp shells from the market below. Inside, the dining table was a battlefield of paper. Blueprints, plant lists, sketches of wind patterns, and coffee mugs in various states of abandonment. Maria sat hunched on one side, pencil moving in quick, sharp strokes. "Here's where the wind comes in hardest," she said, marking arrows along the park's outline. "We plant loblolly pines first, then live oaks to break the gust before they reach the inner rows." Janet leaned closer, chin resting on her hand, eyes tracing the pencil's path. "And the low spots? We turn them into rain gardens," Maria replied without hesitation. "They'll catch the runoff before it can drown anything. Native grasses, wildflowers, deep roots." She circled the areas in neat loops. Janet's gaze lingered on the loops, her mind pulling back to the brown water that had swallowed her childhood porch. "No imported showpieces," she murmured. "Not one," Maria said. "Everything in this plan has survived at least one hurricane. Most more." The ticking of the wall clock filled the quiet for a moment. Janet rubbed the back of her neck, the weight of the paper in front of her pressing into her thoughts. "I'm not here to be remembered. I'm here to make sure what we plant is still standing when Lila's my age." Across the city, the parking garage echoed with the low growl of an engine. Gregory Hunt stepped out from behind a concrete pillar as a black SUV rolled to a stop. The driver killed the lights, stepped out, and flipped back a tarp in the cargo space. Bundles of saplings lay inside, their roots sealed in wet plastic, condensation pooling in the folds. "Shipment's early," the driver muttered. Gregory's eyes swept over the load. Tight, the kind meant to vanish into the night. Back in the apartment, Maria slid the finished blueprint across to Janet. The paper was dense with arrows, circles, and notes in 2 different hands. "Here, everything we've got. Get a couple hours sleep if you can." Janet didn't reach for it immediately. Her eyes stayed on the inked shapes, seeing more than lines. "Tomorrow we start planting," she said softly. "But tonight we plant the idea, and that's what's going to take root." The chamber doors swung open, spilling warm light into the marble hallway. Janet stepped inside with Maria at her shoulder, the blueprint tube clutched tight against her chest. The air in the council room was sharp with cologne and fresh coffee. But beneath it lay something colder, the low buzz of men and women who had already made up their minds. Mayor Ross sat at the center of the long table, his hands folded. Gregory was to his right, silver tie restored to its perfect knot, the corners of his mouth curved just enough to show teeth. "Madam Clerk, let the record show this is an emergency session," Ross said, his voice even. Gregory leaned forward before the mayor could continue. "We are here to discuss whether this diversion," his eyes slid toward Janet, "is worth risking the integrity and timeline of a multi-million-dollar project." Janet didn't sit. She unscrewed the tube and unrolled the plans right on the polished wood, the edges curling up like they wanted to stay hidden. "This," she said, tapping the center quadrant, "isn't a diversion. It's survival. The way you've got it now, half the imports will be dead within a season." A councilman chuckled softly. "And you know this from?" "From 20 years watching this city flood and dry out again," Janet replied without looking away. Gregory gave a short laugh. "We can't make policy based on the instincts of a custodian." Maria's voice cut in, steady and clipped. "Then make it based on data. Soil pH, drainage capacity, wind shear projections, all in this packet." She slid a folder across the table. Ross flipped it open, scanning quickly. His brow furrowed. "Where did you get these?" "City Archives," Maria said, "and the last 5 hurricane impact reports." Gregory shifted in his seat, but Ross raised a hand to silence him. The mayor looked down the table, then back at Janet. 48 hours. One quadrant. If it works, we talk about scaling it. If it doesn't, it will, Janet interrupted, her tone calm but unyielding. The room went still for a moment. As Janet rolled the blueprints back into the tube, Maria caught her eye. There was no smile, no triumphant nod, just the quiet understanding that they'd been handed a match and a pile of damp wood. Outside, the night air was cool against their faces. Janet took a deep breath, the kind that fills your lungs before a storm. 48 hours, she murmured. Let's make them count. The morning broke gray and heavy, the harbor wrapped in a damp mist that clung to skin and clothing alike. Janet stood at the edge of the quadrant she'd been given, a ragged rectangle of soil bordered by construction, fencing, and piles of stone. It didn't look like much, but it was hers. Maria was already there, unloading spades, buckets, and burlap-wrapped saplings from the back of a pickup. So, she said, nodding toward the expanse of churned dirt, where do we start? Janet dropped her bag beside the fence and stepped onto the ground. The soil gave under her boots, cool and damp, smelling faintly of salt. She crouched, scooping a handful, letting it crumble between her fingers. We start where the roots will have the best chance. A shout drew their attention. Mayor Ross was making his way toward them, his polished shoes darkening with each step in the wet earth. He carried no staff, no entourage, just a paper cup of coffee in one hand and an expression that was more curious than official. Janet straightened. Didn't expect you out here. Ross looked down at the soil, then at the small trees lined up like quiet soldiers. If I'm going to back this, he said, I want to understand it. She picked up a young oak, its leaves trembling in the breeze, and handed it to him. Feel its roots, she told him. They know this soil. They've been waiting for it. He turned the burlap in his hands, the rough fabric scratching against his palms. For a moment, he just stood there, the mist beating on his hair, before kneeling beside her. Show me. Maria handed him a spade, and together they dug into the earth, their breaths forming pale clouds in the cool air. The sound of metal biting into soil was steady, rhythmic like a heartbeat. Janet showed him how to loosen the root ball, how to spread it wide so the tree could anchor itself deep. By the time the oak stood upright, Ross's coat was streaked with dirt, his cuffs damp. He looked at his hands, then at the tree, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Not bad for my first day. Janet's lips curved just barely. It's a start. Around them, the fog began to lift, revealing more of the park beyond the fence. Manicured lawns waiting for their imported trees, walkways still under construction. For now, this small patch was all they had. But in the soil beneath their boots, something had already begun to take hold. Maria wiped her forehead with the back of her hand. 47 hours left. Janet glanced at the oak, its leaves catching the weak morning light. Then let's make every one of them count. The sun had barely lifted over the rooftops when Maria's truck rolled to a stop outside the city's storage warehouse. The corrugated metal siding was streaked with rust, the kind that told you no one had cared for it in years. She hopped out, tucking her hair under a ball cap, and slipped a folded clipboard under her arm. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the faint scent of fertilizer and something sharper, damp, sour, almost metallic. She slowed her pace, boots echoing on the concrete. A row of pallets stood against the far wall, each stacked with burlap-wrapped saplings. Plastic stretched tight around their roots, slick with condensation. She crouched by the nearest bundle and pressed her fingers to the damp fabric. It gave too easily. Something wasn't right. With a quick glance over her shoulder, Maria drew her pocket knife and slit the plastic. The smell hit her first, wet rot and decay. She peeled back the burlap, revealing roots blackened and slimy, threads of fungal webbing clinging like cobwebs in the dark. Her stomach dropped. She'd seen root rot before, but never this bad. Her voice low. And you need to get here. Now. Minutes later, Janet stepped through the side door, the smell hitting her just as hard. She didn't need Maria to explain. One look at the rotted roots told her everything. They're planning to plant these, Maria said flatly. Before Janet could reply, the sound of shoes clicking echoed in the warehouse. Gregory emerged from the shadows, his tone sharp. "You have no clearance to be here." Janet didn't flinch. "Neither do diseased trees. But here they are." Gregory's smile was thin. "Every shipment has losses. That's why we overorder." Maria folded her arms. "These aren't losses. They're a plague waiting to spread." Gregory said nothing, only stared, but Janet caught the flicker in his eyes before he turned away. Whatever game he was playing, he didn't want this conversation in the open. As they stepped out into the morning light, Janet felt a knot form deep in her chest. The fight had just shifted. Now it wasn't just about planting, it was about keeping rot from taking root in the heart of the city. Rain tapped against the city hall windows as Janet sat across from Mayor Ross. The lab report spread open between them. The paper smelled faintly of printer ink and bad news. In bold black letters, the numbers stared back at her. 53% infection rate. More than half the imported saplings were already dying before they touched the soil. Ross rubbed a hand over his face. "If this goes public, the council will want a scapegoat." "They'll have one," Janet said, her voice low. Gregory knew. You don't hide rot like that by accident. Before Ross could answer, Maria stepped in, rain beating on her jacket. She dropped a small digital recorder on the desk. "You might want to hear this." Ross pressed play. Gregory's voice filled the office, muffled but clear enough. "Keep them in storage until the janitor screws up. Then we roll my plan out like nothing happened." Ross's eyes hardened. "Where did you?" "Parking garage," Maria replied. "He didn't see me." Janet leaned forward. "You've got the proof. Now we pivot. No imports. We plant local, start now." Ross hesitated only a beat before standing. "Sourcing local, effective immediately. I'll sign the order today." By afternoon, the news had trickled through the hallways. Gregory tried to rally allies on the council, his voice sharp in closed-door whispers. But the recorder had already made its rounds. He was losing ground fast. Meanwhile, the first delivery from a local nursery arrived at the park gates. Rows of sturdy saplings. Their roots wrapped in burlap darkened with clean, healthy soil. Janet ran her fingers over the rough bark, feeling the life under her palm. "Never thought I'd see the day," said an older man in work boots, hauling a flat of wildflowers off the truck. "About time this city planted something that belongs here." Maria grinned, checking the inventory against her list. "Every one of these has survived a hurricane," she said. "Some have seen 3. The rain had eased by the time they started unloading. Volunteers from a neighborhood showed up with gloves and shovels, some carrying thermoses of coffee, others holding small potted plants from their own yards. Even Lila appeared, darting between the grown-ups with a trowel almost as long as her arm. Gregory passed by once, his face tight, his phone pressed to his ear. He didn't stop. Janet watched him go, then turned back to the work in front of her. The fight wasn't over. The clock was still ticking on their 48 hours. But for the first time, the ground beneath her didn't feel like it was slipping away. It felt ready, and so was she. By the next morning, the park's main gate was flanked by 2 bright orange signs. Public demonstration, all welcome. Janet stood at the edge of the taped-off quadrant, raincoat hood pulled low, watching the first trickle of people step through. Some came curious, hands in pockets. Others carried shovels, seed packets, even folding chairs. Maria was already live on her phone, her voice cutting clean into the cool air. 48 hours. 1 quadrant. That's the challenge, she told the viewers, sweeping the camera across the patch of earth. We're planting for survival, not show. Mayor Ross arrived quietly, dressed in boots and an old windbreaker. He didn't head for the microphones clustered near the gate. Instead, he picked up a spade and joined the volunteers. The gesture didn't go unnoticed. Heads turned, phones came up, flashes popped. Janet knelt beside a boy no older than 8, showing him how to break the burlap around a root ball without tearing it. "You're giving it room to breathe," she told him. He nodded solemnly and pressed the soil down with small hands. Through it all, Gregory lingered near the far fence, arms folded. His suit looked out of place against the mud. but his eyes were locked on every camera in sight. Midday, the drizzle stopped and a shaft of sunlight broke through, spilling over the freshly turned soil. Butterflies found the wildflowers within minutes. A sparrow landed on the young oak they'd planted the day before. It felt like the park was answering back. Maria pointed to the rain garden trench they'd dug, already holding clear water from the morning shower. Proof, she said simply. By the second afternoon, the quadrant was alive with motion. An artist painted a mural on the temporary fencing, deep green roots curling into the shape of the city skyline. A bus driver brought his whole route's worth of passengers to help. Someone set up a table with coffee and biscuits. It was no longer just a planting, it was a gathering. Gregory made his move late in the day, striding toward the mayor with a clipboard. "This sideshow is costing us time," he said, voice pitch for the nearest microphone. Ross didn't flinch. "Time well spent," he replied, and gestured toward the trench, the saplings, the crowds. "Take a look." Phones caught the moment. The former project, lead outflanked by a janitor in a city that had decided the fight, was theirs too. As the sun dipped low, casting the park in amber light, Janet leaned on her shovel, hands sore, boots caked in mud. Around her, the quadrant was no longer bare earth. It was the beginning of something rooted and real. And tomorrow, the council would have to decide if they were ready to let it grow. 30 days later, the city gathered at the park gates beneath a sky so clear it looked painted. The chain-link fencing was gone, replaced by a wooden archway carved with the words, "Truth grows here." Janet stood just behind the ribbon, Lila at her side, the girl's small hand wrapped tight around her mother's fingers. Mayor Ross stepped up to the microphone. His voice carried easily across the crowd, but there was no grand political cadence, just a steady, honest tone. "A park isn't something you win," he said. "It's something you tend." He paused, glancing toward Janet. "And sometimes, the right caretaker doesn't come from where you expect." Applause rippled through the crowd. Cameras flashed, but Janet's eyes were on the trees. The quadrant they'd fought for was now a lush pocket of green, oaks and pines holding their ground, wildflowers scattering color in the breeze. The rain garden shimmered with clean water, dragonflies skimming its surface. At the edge of the crowd, Gregory lingered in a suit that seemed heavier than the heat demanded. He'd been stripped of his project roll weeks ago, the recorder and the rotted saplings sealing his fate. Now he watched from a distance, an outsider in the park he once claimed as his own. Ross cut the ribbon, and the crowd surged forward, spilling into the pathways. Children darted toward the open grass. Couples strolled hand in hand beneath the young trees. An older woman knelt to touch the wildflowers, her lips curving into a smile. Lila tugged on Janet's sleeve. "You planted the right friends," she said softly, eyes on the sturdy oaks. Janet laughed, the sound catching her throat. "We planted them together." The local news crews captured all. The faces, the laughter, the way people lingered as if they'd found a place worth keeping. But what the cameras couldn't catch was the undercurrent that moved through the crowd, the quiet pride of a city that had stood behind the truth, even when it came from an unexpected voice. As the sun began to lower, painting the park in gold, Janet stood near the rain garden, watching the ripples dance. Maria joined her, handing over a paper cup of lemonade. "Looks like it's breathing," she said. "It is," Janet replied. "And so is the city." For a long moment, they stood in comfortable silence, listening to the rustle of leaves. Then Janet glanced toward the crowd, her voice low but certain. "If you believe in something worth keeping, fight for it. Plant it. Protect it, even if you're the only one holding the shovel at first." She turned back to the rain garden, her reflection shimmering in the water. "Because one voice," she murmured, "can grow a forest." And somewhere in the laughter, the footsteps, and the settling roots, the park answered back.